The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents The American Church in 1965. How you doing? I hope you're well. Some of you may know I love to go antique shopping, and sometimes I stumble across something exceptional. And while this is not some collector's item, I imagine you can probably get old copies for $5, $6, $10, something like that. In 1965, the July 27th, 1965 issue of Look magazine, which was 25 cents, had the Battle of the Bible on its cover, a blunt report on Protestant turmoil, is your God a myth, trivia on Sunday, can the church survive? They also did an article on the other man from U.N.C.L.E. But I saw this in an antique shop, and I had to pick it up. And I'm going to read some excerpts from this article by T. George Harris, and comment a little bit about it. Remember, this is July 27th, 1965. It starts by saying, you feel religious restlessness everywhere you go. The big denominations, long placid, are suddenly possessed by turmoil. Pope Paul needs all of his authority to control, or try to, the revolution in Roman Catholicism. But Protestantism, with no central machinery, is rocked even more violently by the same historic disturbance. Now, you have to remember, this is 1965, so it was right after the end of Vatican II, or the Second Vatican Council. A couple of notes here. Timid pastors have come down from their safe pulpits to march with Negroes. Right-wing political activists, quoting scripture, are throwing their fervor into religious conflict. But the ferment, not just political, cuts across all secular lines. So this is also shortly after the Selma March. And what we're going to hear about in this article is a little bit of everything. In 1965, we had not only a Catholic Church that was in disarray, or recovering from disarray, kind of, but a Protestant church that was largely out of touch with people's daily lives. And so it continues on talking about the urbane types adopt strict disciplines of meditation and tithes, then worship like early church laymen in apartments and offices. They believe the church can live again only when it abandons protective buildings, orthodoxy, bureaucracy, and takes its chances in the daily world of doubt. So you had people who were essentially saying, you know, your old church is stale. You're being too literal about things. We're done with the fire and brimstone, sinners in the hands of an angry God sort of thing. He continues, clerics sit in on big business decisions to doubt the ethics of policy or goad executives on to be co-creators with Christ. Now that one line doesn't get followed up on, but we can see that this was being recognized in 65 as the church integrating itself more into business decisions. If we can get CEOs on board, if we can get politicians on board, if we can reach these people, we can maintain our relevance. Almost unnoticed, the article continues, the scriptures themselves. In 36 new plain English versions, some near slang, are rolling upon us. Sales rose 42% last year, and not just to fill bookcases. Is this just another revival? Will a wave of TV tent men drive millions more to church? Not likely. The crisis runs deeper. It is nothing less, activists say, than the dawn of a new Reformation. Well, we did actually have TV tent men shortly after this who did convince millions to go to church. Now, it was a decade or so afterwards, and we'll get to that a little later. But the author seemed legitimately concerned about what Protestantism could actually save out of this with these changes. What could they do? What would we expect? And how are they going to do this? Could they survive? And it seems incredibly unlikely to the author that we're going to have TV evangelists who are going to wind up bringing millions of people into the church and active again, which turned out to be the case. Continuing on with this article, from the conservative side, Dr. Carl Henry, editor of Christianity Today, slaps the churches. They're all sick for opposite reasons. Nervous traditionalists, sure they had the final truth built into the sanctuary, fear that Satan himself is gutting Protestantism for the last demoralization, or as they call it, the deformation. So there's a lot of concern here that, hey, Protestantism is being taken over by Satan. And some of this is coming out as the conflicting propaganda between a reformed Vatican 2.0 Catholic Church begins to come out. Protestants are struggling, which is where we're getting this. This is also, by the way, the same year, and there's an article in here, where John Huston was getting ready to release his movie Noah. But one theologian says, we have to tear away the dead flesh so the new flesh can grow. The tearing finally comes down to the substance of belief. Quite a lot's been going on among theologians without the news spreading down to the pews. Many a minister has looked out over his congregation and wondered how much he dare tell them about the conflict between their religion and his. Now, think about that sentence again, because what we're talking about here is philosophical arguments and disagreements about doctrine and orthodoxy are plaguing Protestant pastors because they don't know how to give this information to the people in the pews, to let them know that their notion and concept of God is dramatically different from the person standing in the pulpit. I remember early on when I was hosting the Atheist experience, Jeff D talked about how his parents, who were both ministers, when he started discovering the truth about the religion, he would go to them and say, what about this? What about this? And they would acknowledge that they knew these things. It's just that the people in the pews weren't ready to hear it. And so it's clear that Jeff's parents were right in the midst of this. They can tell them about the difference between the religion of the people in the pews and the religion of the people in the pulpit. He may not just be afraid of his job, though, as the Wall Street Journal recently reported. Many have quit because of friction between the old and the new guard. He also doubts his right to unsettle people who have found satisfaction in traditional assertions of faith. I just try to take the old words, like hell, says one congregational minister, and find new meaning in them. Now, I don't know how involved any of you have been in church throughout your life. I was incredibly active from the age of 5 all the way up until I graduated from high school. And I've watched this battle take place over and over again in different areas, at different times and to different degrees. This notion that the public isn't ready to know what the ministers know, that we need to gradually shift religion so that it makes more sense to people, and we don't want to take away their hope. We don't want to tell them the truth about this because they've constructed this notion of God. So if hell is an uncomfortable word for my particular parishioners, I will use some other thing, which is how you get to annihilation theory and separation from God and things like that. Continuing on, then Robinson said he would have tend to be more jealous of the beliefs that those people have rejected. Then why do it? The Christian gospel is in perpetual conflict with the images of God set up in the minds of men, even of Christian men, as they seek in each generation to encompass his meaning. These images fulfill an essential purpose to focus on the unknowable, to enclose the inexhaustible, so that ordinary men and women can get their minds around God and have something on which to fix their imagination and prayers. But as soon as they become a substitute for God, as soon as they become God, then we have a new idolatry. So the pastors are essentially saying, look, these people have their vision of God, and that's what they're praying to. That's what they're imagining is watching over them. And it's very different from our understanding. And have they built an idol of their God concept? And I've said before that if you go to any Christian church, there's as many gods and God concepts as there are people in there, or each one of them has a slightly different notion of God. How do you reconcile that? And why hasn't there been a God that's actually done something about it? So a recasting will, I'm convinced, leave the fundamental truth of the gospel unaffected, but it means that we have to be prepared for everything to go into the melting, even our most cherished religious categories and moral absolutes. And the first thing we must be ready to let go of is our image of God himself. This goes on to talk about some of the prominent thinkers within Christianity at the time, and how one of them, his mind roams from automation to Aristotle to pop art and gives it all human coherence. While philosophy has degenerated into a word game, language logic, social science into a numbers racket, surveys, and art into a repetitive advertisement of human despair, Tillich has grabbed the complexity of the isolated disciplines and showed that they make no sense without a unifying reality, which is God. Now, this grounding of the ultimate ground of being is what philosophers were trying to foist onto the church, in the sense of, it's not just true because we've got the book and everything else. There needs to be an ultimate ground of being. And how long can man bear emptiness and despair? The indications, though, the half-frustrated idealism of the Peace Corps vets and students, slum teachers, the riots against factory universities teaching depersonalized subjects, the life is absurd theme in art and literature, the Negro's revolt against being the invisible man. So we're seeing this in 1965. Looking at it today in 2021, there's still this issue of the African American being often invisible. This is what is often meant by systemic racism or implicit racism. It's not that you had to burn a cross or hate black people. It's the fact that they are invisible and not considered equal. This is the same thing we were dealing with in 65. And in this case, what you had was the radical right's demonic fear that the citizen has become only a social security number in a collective machine. This is where the fear-mongering starts. It mentions atheism in this article too, which always catches my eye. The cocky atheism of intellectuals has also crumbled into fear. Albert Camus, the late French novelist, had the courage to face the consequences of a universe in which he believed man is alone. Here's what frightens me, he said, to see the sense of this life dissipated, to see our reason for existence disappear. This is what is intolerable. Men cannot live without meaning. We're back to the same lie that many of us have heard before, that a life without a God to impose a meaning means that a life is meaningless. And yet my life has exactly the meaning that I choose for it and whatever purpose I choose for it. And it has that value as well. And other people's lives matter to me in part because we interact. I realize that this article is being written by someone who likely was penning on behalf of their Catholicism, I think, about the Protestant church in disarray. And so they hadn't, there's one brief mention of atheism and that's it. But he also quotes a Kentucky pastor who said that they can't imagine dying for their, quote, ultimate ground of being. So basically it's noting that these philosophical arguments don't drive the passions. They don't inspire someone to be better, to die for a cause, to hold something greater than them. It's just an intellectual exercise. Oh, there's an ultimate ground of being. And once again, as I've said many times before, why doesn't God correct this? Why is it that these men, devout men, sincere devout men of multitude of different beliefs, are floundering and arguing with each other and desperately trying to make their religious beliefs relevant to the public, when God could come in and make it all relevant to everyone instantly? Reinhold Niebuhr said the race crisis saved the church from irrelevancy. Many others concur, but reporters, though startled by the Alabama turnout, still treat church involvement as just one more phase of the civil rights struggle. Most miss the deeper happening. Christianity has marched back into the stormy center of American life, there to lose itself and or save itself. And the pastor of one of the biggest Baptist congregations, 1700, was met with attacks claiming that he was a communist, that he was not a minister of God, all because his church was working alongside the black community as well. There's a couple of lines here towards the end of the article that I want to get on, and then I want to summarize a couple things. Toward the end, it says, in theology, the liberals and conservative evangelicals have moved close enough to fight each other on common ground. It's such a strange sentence to me to see that evangelicals, including liberals and conservatives, evangelicals have joined the search for translation flaws in the King James Bible. Few try to soothsay from isolated passage. They want a full rational position from which to defend scriptural authority against the liberal instinct for freedom and change. So there's still a conflict here. They want a full rational position from which to defend scriptural authority from freedom and change that the liberals would like to see. For their part, the far-out liberal thinkers have turned back from the extremes of demythology to a new quest for the Christ who hides himself in the stable of human history. Intellectual Christians and evangelist groups alike, unknown to each other, have taken the same direction. Both leave Noah's Ark to the movie makers and legalistic definitions of sin to the old folks. Legalism somehow is death. The witness has always led men to do unexpected things. He's talking about the witness of the Gospels. As it grows stronger, as the church surges back into the world, the turmoil that shakes Protestantism will grow more, not less intense. We may yet find out why the prudent Romans fed their lions on Christian meat. This is 1965. As I mentioned at the outset, so this was right after the Second Vatican Council, where you had a confused and conflicted Catholic Church, but the American Protestant Church was looking for meaning, looking for a way to stay relevant. Church attendance was on the decline. We were moving closer and closer to free love, summer of love, hippies, anti-war stuff, civil rights conflicts, and loaves and fishes and Noah's Ark just didn't hold any relevance for people, or as much as they would need to keep churches going. There were liberals and conservatives looking at religion in practice rather than the philosophical, rather than the evidential, although both of those were there as well, which is how we got that ultimate ground of being. But it was a time of trying to make church matter. And they were siding with African Americans in civil rights protests. I was born 4 years, or just shy of 4 years, after that article came out. The magazine, Look magazine, which was a competitor to Life, and featured Norman Rockwell and other individuals as well, like Stanley Kubrick was a staff photographer for Look for a while. It was a fairly prominent magazine. I didn't just pick up some out in the middle of nowhere magazine. This is why you can still get copies of this. But that magazine ceased publication 2 years after I was born in 1971. But the figures here, the individuals and their ideas, held sway within Christendom until the rise of the moral majority and the near complete takeover of fundamentalist Protestantism by right-wing ideology. I wonder what sort of Christian I would have been had I been alive in 1965 versus 1985. And if the church had continued to work towards being relevant to people rather than political views, if I'd have found my way out, or if I might have stayed a believer working on good political goals, and God was just an abstract concept governing force that inspired me to work towards justice and fairness and freedom. I wonder if we'd have as much to object to if we'd had these sorts of disputes about how much of an intellectual exercise is it, how much of an evidence issue is it, and how much of it is just emotional, inspirational, faith-based. Clearly, on purely epistemological grounds, Christianity is an abject failure. But Christianity on social grounds, when the best of its people are working towards the best goals, was not only far less objectionable, it was almost something to aspire to. More like the comforting lie of telling your kids that they can be anything they want when they grow up. We know it's not true, and it's a hyperbolic encouragement that helps thwart the discouragement we know they're going to experience. Now, don't get me wrong, I have no space in my life for religion as a comforting lie. I don't want it, I don't need it, and I don't encourage it for other people as well. But it has become something so much worse than a comforting lie. It's become a comforting lie that marginalizes people, that actively works to set aside other people's rights, to stand in opposition to freedom and, in some cases, health concerns as we're dealing with a global pandemic. I don't know what could have happened differently, but in the battles to make religion relevant, we lost. I don't mean atheists lost. I mean all of us lost, because we went from something that was striving towards social good to something that was striving towards their self-proclaimed ideological political good. I wish it were different. I wonder what I would be doing today if it were. And I wonder who would be calling into the shows and who I'd be responding to. But I love going antique shopping and finding this article. It's July 27th issue from 1965 of Look magazine. If you want a copy, I know there's archives online where you can go get some for, just a few dollars. I find stuff like that incredibly interesting because now we're 2021. We're 53 years later. And yet we're having some of the same discussions and some of the same battles. But this time, there are prominent atheist speakers all over with a platform and the ability to reach massive audiences so that the people sitting in the pew who aren't being told the truth by the pastors can find it elsewhere if they're brave enough to look if they're honest enough and willing to question the foundation of their beliefs rather than just assuming that they're so and fighting tooth and nail to convince others. See you next time. Bye-bye.